Good morning. My name is Rob Hodgman, and I'm the Aviation Senior Planner for the Washington State Department of Transportation. I want to thank you for the opportunity to present to you this morning on aeronautics in Washington State. This presentation was requested by my colleague, Representative Brad Klippert, who is the co-chair for the Aviation Legislative Caucus. In 2012, WSDOT Aviation commissioned the Economic Impact Study, the Aviation Economic Impact Study, and as a result from that study, these 17 user-derived benefits, which we now also refer to as aviation activities, were the result. And these are the topics that really comprise aeronautics in Washington State. WSDOT Aviation's role, you see here I've got some excerpts from the RCW. RCW 476810 talks about policy, and then you see the general powers down below. And really what these talk about is a combination of WSDOT Aviation's responsibility both to promote aeronautics and to develop a system of airports and air navigation facilities. The question is, what exactly does aeronautics mean? So then again, from the RCW, here's an excerpt from some of the definitions. There's 4 bullet points here. First one, transportation by aircraft. So whether that's commercial passenger service or charter or air taxi, or whether that's general aviation, recreational flying. The second one speaks to aircraft, and you can see it talks about construction. So that would be aerospace manufacturing. Repair and maintenance, so that's maintenance, repair, and overhaul, MRO. At both aircraft, at power plants, and then, of course, accessories. The third bullet talks about airports and air navigation facilities, and so it's establishment of the construction, extension, operation, improvement, and so forth for airports. And then the fourth one speaks to instruction in aviation. It talks about flying and ground subjects pertaining thereto. So that would be workforce development in terms of pilot training, aviation maintenance, and related career fields. So the connection then is that these aviation activities occur at airports, and you can see moving people and goods, supporting research, supporting industry, flight training, and a variety of the other aviation activities are addressed, all to save lives, protect property, promote business activities, and support recreation and tourism. But since there are 17 aviation activities, and I only have about 25 minutes for this presentation, I'm just going to focus on 5. Commercial passenger service, business and corporate transportation, pilot training and certification, air cargo, and agriculture, otherwise known as aerial application. Start first with commercial passenger service. Tremendous benefit, worldwide transportation. But there is a concern or a challenge, and that is that the regional airports sometimes struggle with the number of flights and the availability of transportation from our regional communities. There's 2 sets of causes. You can see here on the left supply causes, and I'll go into those in a little bit more detail, but airline consolidation, airline industry changes, modernized fleet, and pilot shortage are some of the contributing factors. And then demand causes, infrequent flights, flight times are inconvenient, high ticket prices, and in many cases only one destination or one connection. So the impact is, and I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail as well, 2 Washington State airports who previously had commercial passenger service now have lost that service. Regional airports regularly have challenges with infrequent and inconvenient flights, and in many cases the only destination is SeaTac. So how do you understand how well we're doing at commercial passenger service? Well, a couple of means to measure. And there are many ways to measure. I've chosen 2. So we've got available seat miles, which really is the supply side of the equation. And that's the capacity, the number of seats on board an aircraft for a distance or a duration of a flight. And then the demand is enplanement. So that's passengers actually boarding the aircraft. So we're going to talk a little bit about supply and demand and how that's manifested in Washington State airports. This is statewide, and you can see it covers more than a decade here, from 2002 to 2016, and this is all commercial passenger service airports combined. Obviously, SeaTac carries the weight of that volume. By far, it outpaces all the other airports, and so this number, this graph certainly is heavily influenced by SeaTac. If you remove SeaTac and Spokane airports from the equation, all of a sudden, the supply side is looking a little bit different. Still an upward trend you can see there on the trend line, but something happens in 2013, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. As far as the demand, again, this is statewide demand, and you can see that the demand graph is almost identical to the supply graph, statewide commercial passenger service. Whereas here, when you, again, focus only on the regional airports, you see the supply is a little bit different, and so it really kind of begs the question, is supply influencing demand, or is demand influencing supply? So we're going to explore that. In those areas of industry factors, airline consolidation, airline industry changes as relates to new ATP rules, airline transport pilot certification, airline capacity management and economic factors, and then a modernized fleet and the pilot shortage. And so on the right side of this screen, you can see here the two supply charts that I showed you before. The top one is statewide supply, and then the bottom one is regional supply. And I'm going to use the regional supply chart as a backdrop, and I'm going to progressively build on this chart in order to show you some of the activities that are occurring in Washington State commercial passenger service. First, let's talk about airline mergers. So you can see here, these are major airlines. Delta Airlines acquires Northwest in around 2008 timeframe. United Airlines acquires Continental Airlines, and then American Airlines acquires U.S. Airways. And while these are major nationwide airlines, there is an impact in the regional market, not only in terms of the large major airlines oftentimes have regional partners that provide those connections, but that there's a trickle-down effect that occurs. We know that in general, large commercial service flights are much more profitable than the small regional. And so when you look at the merger is an indication of the marketplace, and that indication in the marketplace then helps understand maybe what's impacting at the regional level. Let's add a layer. So in 2010, Congress passed the Airline Safety and Federal Aviation Administration Act, and there were many instructions in that act that were given to the FAA, but two in particular related to commercial passenger service. Whereas before, you could have the first officer sitting in the right seat with a commercial rating and a minimum of 250 hours, this act directed the FAA to develop new rules that now the pilot sitting in the right seat has to have an airline transport pilot rating, an ATP, and 1,500 hours, which is reducible in some circumstances depending on the source of their education. That rule took effect in 2013. So as we see the graph of supply, we start to see some of the marketplace influences that are occurring. First, we've got the airline mergers. Second, we've got the new rules on ATP, which is shrinking the availability of workforce to provide commercial passenger service. And then there are some economic factors. So we know that late 2007, early 2008, the Great Recession hit. It lasted about 18 months, which is reflected here in about midway of 2009. However, we know that the recovery was very, very sluggish. So what that does is that creates a challenge in the marketplace where less passengers are wanting to travel, and where there's more pressure on the price per ticket. So that increases the challenges the airline industry has. And so you can see, again, as the slide continues to build layer upon layer, there are a lot of marketplace factors that are all coming to bear. And finally, let's talk about fuel price. So this dotted line, and you can see the scale here on the right, this is price per gallon of jet fuel that was paid at various different times during this time frame. And you can see how that influences the marketplace as well. So a lot of indicators all building up to a lot of pressure on the airline industry, a very challenging economic environment for them to not only be profitable, but just to survive. And what resulted is that somewhere in 2012, the airlines started to pull back and take a different perspective on this. And they recognized we can't keep doing business this way. We're losing money. We're having to merge with other airlines just to stay afloat. And so they started carefully controlling their capacity. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, there's a couple of different examples. One of them is that the airlines started to focus their attention on the large and medium hub airports. That's where there's the greatest concentration of passengers traveling through those airports for connecting flights, so better source of travelers. Those airports are also usually near large urban areas. Again, another source of travelers. Another factor that occurs is that the airlines start to divest of their legacy fleet. They have pretty good sized airplanes that are not maybe as fuel efficient as some of the airplanes that are being manufactured now. And so they divest the legacy fleet, they buy newer airplanes that are more fuel efficient and have more seats. So that factor of more seats gives them the opportunity to potentially have less flights. So say, for example, an airline is flying from Chicago to Vegas. Instead of doing 4 flights a day, with an increase in seat capacity, they may only need to do 3 flights a day. We've talked about the mergers and the acquisitions. Let's say that you have 2 airlines that are both flying the same route. 2 airlines flying from Chicago to Vegas. After those airlines merge, now you don't have a duplication of those routes. So many factors going on in the marketplace, but the one that impacts the regional market is that because that's in general less profitable for the airlines, and because those are smaller seat airplanes, they're less fuel efficient, they're less economical, lower density of traveling public at those airports, the airports pull back from those markets and focus their efforts on the larger markets. In addition, you can see here, this is the FAA forecast 2016 to 2036. So this is a 20-year time period. The first bullet there talks about a reduction in the number of regional airplanes. Now, that's not a big reduction from 2144 to 1961. However, you've got to recognize that this is in a 20-year time period, and you remember you saw the trend lines showing growth. So we've got a growth industry, yet we've got a contraction of the available fleet to fly in the regional markets. As I mentioned before, divesting of legacy fleet. So for example, here you can see removing 50-seat aircraft and then replacing them with larger aircraft, 75, 100, 125-seat aircraft. So this is a really good example. If you were to divest of a 50-seat aircraft and buy a 100-seat aircraft, instead of having 4 flights a day from a given location, maybe now you only need 2. So as I spoke earlier on a slide about some of the infrequent flights, inconvenient flight times, that's how this connects, is that as there are greater seat capacity, there are less flights, and that influences, it's a supply, but it's also a demand function. The third bullet really talks about divesting of the turboprop and the piston fleet. And some of that is actually removal of aircraft from the fleet, but in many cases that is exchanging the piston aircraft for a turbofan, a regular jet aircraft. In the end, the analysis is fewer airplanes equals fewer flights, larger airplanes equals fewer flights, and fewer flights is inconvenience for the price-sensitive personal traveler and schedule conflicts and increased costs for the business traveler. Now let's talk about the pilot shortage and how that is manifested. This information is from the Regional Airline Association, and you can see here in the time frame from 2013 to 2016, 309 of the roughly 500 airports across the nation that provide commercial service recognized a 10% or more schedule reduction. In that same time frame, 208 airports recognized a schedule reduction of 20% or more, and 52 airports nationwide lost commercial service altogether. And in particular, as relates to Washington State, in 2007, Moses Lake lost commercial service, so it's been about a decade. In this time period, Port Angeles lost commercial service in 2014. So this is a very real statistic here in Washington State. So in summary, commercial passenger service, airlines have consolidated, which leads to reduced competition. They've focused their efforts on large and medium hub airports, and you can see some of the ones here in Washington State are listed. They're purchasing larger airplanes, which means fewer flights, reduced service to regional airports, and then the pilot shortage is eliminating flights and discontinuing air service at some Washington State airports. What are some options for resolving this? Well, certainly community partnerships. We know that airlines are looking for revenue. And if there's a local community that wants to increase their passenger service, There's some dialogue that can be had with an airline, maybe some kind of a guarantee that has been successful in other parts of the country, where a community will commit to the airline of filling seats. Another option is increasing the trained pilot pool. We know that as the pilot workforce has continued to shrink, that the regional airlines are the ones who are the bill payer. The pilots leave those lower salary jobs and move to the larger commercial service airports, which creates a condition where there are not enough pilots to fly to the regional airports on the regional carriers. And third, incentives to the carriers, not just as relates to commitment from the community, but tax incentives and other business advantages that will help increase the airline's profitability. Which is a great segue now here to talk about pilot training. Provides a workforce to meet the traveler needs. The challenge is there are not enough pilots to meet air travel demand. Why is that? Retiring workforce is now a mandatory retirement age of 65, and we're experiencing that now. We've been experiencing that for the last 3 or 4 years. The increased student pilot requirement, as I mentioned before, 1,500 hours for an ATP certificate, that is reducible depending on your source of schooling. For example, here in Washington State, if you graduate from Central Washington University's flight training program, it's 1,000 hours. If you graduate from Big Bend Community College, it's 1,250 hours. If you're prior military and meet certain conditions, it's as low as 750 hours. But still, normally those students graduate with 250 hours. So there's a big gap of flight time that has to be accomplished before they can fly right seat in a commercial airliner. And third, that there's a continual increase in commercial passenger demand, not only domestic but international, and I'll show you that in a subsequent slide. So as I mentioned, large flight time gap from the time a student graduates from an academic institution until they've got the minimum hours to fly with an ATP rating. Reduced opportunities to fly. It used to be that they could fly right seat as a commercial pilot and they could build their time. Now that's no longer, because of Congress and the FAA rule, that's no longer an option. And insufficient flight school capacity, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in a subsequent slide. So the impact is loss of or reduction of regional service commercial service at the regional airports. Options: partnering with airlines for some kind of workforce development pathways, and there are some success stories here in Washington State and around the country, but we're still very early in developing those partnerships. And increase the flight hour, student capacity in flight training. So what does that mean? That means when students graduate from a flight training program, maybe they can have more than 250 hours. I know that Central Washington University's got a very innovative program where they bring students back to be certified flight instructors to work with the students that are behind them in the pipeline. So we talk about the pilot shortage. Here's some details and facts about it. From a very credible source, the 2016 Boeing Pilot and Technician Outlook, more than 2 million new aviation personnel will be needed between now and 2035, and specifically 617,000 commercial airline pilots. So you can see that reflected here in the chart below. The world total, 617,000 pilots needed in the next 20 years. The North American portion of that is 112,000, but you can see there's also a pretty distinct demand in Asia Pacific of 248,000 and in Europe of 104,000. So just because a pilot gets their training in the United States doesn't mean that they're going to stay in the United States. They may go to another market where the job is available and where the salaries are better. I did a cursory review of some data from the FAA on the number of flight training programs that are recognized by the FAA. We're talking universities, community and technical colleges, and learned that there are 112 across the United States. 112,000 pilots needed in North America, divided by 112 institutions, is 1,000 students per academic institution over the next 20 years. So divide that 1,000 by 20 and you get a minimum of 50 students graduating from each academic institution every year for the next 20 years. Apply that to Washington State. So there are 5 schools here in Washington State that are recognized by the FAA as University, Community, and Technical College. So 5 schools times 1,000 students. Washington State's share of the pie is 5,000 students in the next 20 years. 5 schools at 50 students apiece. That's 250 students Washington State needs to graduate every year just to keep pace with the demand. And if we want to be a leader, a national leader, then we need to graduate more students than that. Okay, switching gears now, a good segue is to talk about business and corporate aviation. As I mentioned, there's roughly 500 commercial passenger airports across the United States. The benefit of the commercial aviation is that it's flexible, it's time-saving, and it increases the revenue at smaller airports. So business aviation depends very heavily on corporate and business travel. There are more than 5,000 public airports, but only around 500 that provide commercial service. So business aviation allows you to travel to locations that maybe do not have commercial service. Also, you're then less dependent upon flight schedules, and you could potentially fly to your destination, do your business, and return, versus commercial passenger travel, all that time at TSA and at the airport and changing planes or whatever it is that you need to do. Business aviation has a lot of benefits as far as efficiency and productivity. The challenge that business aviation is facing, and quite frankly that all of general aviation is facing, concern, is the ATC privatization, which really relates to transitioning the air traffic control service from the FAA to a private non-for-profit company. That service would then, that company would then be funded by user fees, which would be paid by business aviation and other general aviation, as well as the airlines. Very expansive topic. Don't have time to drill down on that today, but certainly this is something that we need to keep our eye on and continue to work towards. So the options for helping promote business aviation, support the benefits of business aviation, and better understand the ATC privatization notion that's being discussed. Air cargo. Air cargo is a tremendous capability. It provides fast transport of high demand and perishable products. The forecast over the next 20 years shows an increase in the air cargo fleet, but the concern with this industry is that it may not be as available to customers as they would like to meet their needs. What are the causes for that? This industry is very much driven by what I call the back shops. So you've got the carriers who actually carry the freight on board their aircraft, but there are a whole bunch of other processes and steps that freight has to go through. Freight forwarders, expediters, and a variety of different other handlers. And so it's really that back shop machine that has to be in place in order to enable air cargo. There have been questions, why can't we fly cherries that are harvested in central and eastern Washington? Why can't we fly them from central and eastern Washington? Well, as you can see here, the third bullet, modal freight options compete for transportation choices. And so if that freight forwarder expediter capability is not in place, then really there's no choice but to truck it to SeaTac or Portland International. Why is it that infrastructure is not in place? Well, you can see in the second bullet here, supporting activities require substantial capital and workforce investment. So if we're talking facilities, equipment, and then a trained workforce year-round, not just for a couple of months during the summer when we're harvesting the fruit. In order for them to make that investment, they need to have year-round throughput. That's one of the challenges that this industry faces as far as being able to expand air cargo. It's a slow growth industry. Domestic air freight is only about 2% annual. International, it's about 6% to Asia and 5% to Europe. And those numbers change a little bit. So not a dramatic growth in this industry. And it's only for a narrow band of products because it is so expensive. It really is only, as I mentioned here in the top, high demand and perishable products. The impact is that we've got really 4 airports here in Washington State that do a large volume of air cargo. And of course, SeaTac is the highest concentration for that. So options: partner with the freight industry to develop some new solutions in order to expand our footprint across Washington State to provide air cargo services at other locations. And my last topic of today will be agriculture aviation, which we also know as aerial applicators. Benefits of aerial applicators is that they protect crops from a variety of different fungi and insects and weeds. There are 44 operators here in Washington State, and they spray approximately 20% of all farmable land. That results in, depending upon the crop yield and the economic environment, between $40 and $80 million annually. Provide a variety of different tasks, which you can see here in the fine print. The concern with this industry is the regulatory challenges. There's a misperception that the spraying is unsafe, it's hazardous. There certainly is a big push for organic crops, and so there's a lot of misconceptions and concerns relating to regulation with this industry. Options is to learn more about these and provide that technical assistance to the aerial applicator community. That's my presentation today. If you'd like to follow up with me, you can see my contact information here, my phone number, and my email address. I'm based in Olympia at the Olympia Airport with Washington State Department of Transportation Aviation Division. Thank you.